Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week on the podcast, we wanted to tackle this notion of the ego-self axis, which is a term that we've used on the podcast before, and we've described it really briefly, but it's an important idea, and so we wanted to really unpack it. Now, it isn't one of Jung's ideas. It was articulated by Edward Edinger, but it clearly is built on Jung's notion of the ego and the self and the importance of the relationship between them. So I think that we're going to see as we walk around this today that it's a real central notion about how psychic development progresses. And I think I'll just leave it there, and maybe we can jump in and kind of provide a bit of a definition before we really unroll this.
I think the ego-self axis for me is one of the images and concepts that I use very frequently working with clients, because it helps to ground this sort of abstract and mysterious notion of the self to the sense of ego or our I. And by imagining a line, connecting them, and I often kind of gesture from my forehead down to my abdomen of how these two things are actually connected by, almost a roadway or a channel. And I think that Edinger did all of us a great service here, building on the work of Eric Neumann, and Michael Fordham, who did a lot of infant work. And they postulate that when a baby is born, the ego is, of course, not yet developed, and it is subsumed within the self. And the infant is a whole, an organic, unconscious, but self whole, as we know from every infant anybody has ever observed. Someone is there, but it's not an ego yet. And this baby is a deity, as we know from the Christ myth. And then slowly the ego starts to differentiate out from this wholeness of the self. And as the child grows into young adulthood, it separates out more and more. And then there's a little connection between the larger whole of the self and the smaller whole of the ego, the sense of our subjective identity. And eventually, there is both separation and connection that you could imagine by having a larger circle with a smaller circle right on top of it and a line connecting the two. And that is a nice representation of the process of individuation, of your own unique selfhood and connection to a larger whole that we might call the God image.
Right. So I think we're leaning into needing at least a brief definition of the self in Jungian terms.
Well, I think that there's a distinction between the self and the images by which the self is known. That in Jung's volume that he titled Ion, he let us know that the true nature of the self, like the true nature of God, is impenetrable, that we can only get glimpses of how this might function psychospiritually. And the most reasonable phenomenologic evidence that Jung was interested in were the ways that the divine has been represented from antiquity forward, starting with organic forms, worshiping animal images, then the progression of human-animal hybrids, moving through the various gods and deities of ancient religions, ending for what Jung felt was the image of Christ as a fully anthropomorphic image of the divine, which suggested that human beings had begun to gain access to the forces of the self because they could find themselves connected to it imagistically. So when we talk about the self, we're talking about the central spiritual engine that all human beings, perhaps even all life, rests upon. In some initiatic traditions, it is symbolized by a skeleton, and the skeleton being the bones or the structural element of life, which is not visible from the outside, but which allows the entity to exist structurally and have mobility and express impact on the environment.
So we might think of the self as the God within, which is a way that Jung described it at one point. We might think about it as the center and circumference, which is another way that Jung described it. It's that sense of some part of us that is eternal, that is infinite, that has access to greater wisdom. So it's a very big concept, and yet a very important one, because according to Jung, as you said, Joseph, all life rests upon this. I'm thinking there's I believe it's a Polynesian expression that Joseph Campbell talks about, and it's the expression is simply hunting for minnows, standing on the back of a whale.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's such a profound image, because we go through our lives on a day-to-day basis concerning ourselves with our little problems, with our minnows. But all the while, the life of the ego rests upon the back of the self, of this numinous ground of being that is so much larger than ourselves. So that would be maybe a way of thinking about the self. What we've been talking about for the past few minutes has been rarefied and maybe a little bit difficult to pin down or grasp. And I think that that's just the way it is. But I want to go back to something you said, Deb, a minute ago, which is that you work with this concept all the time and you find it really useful. And I want to second that, because for all that this is a little bit esoteric, maybe, it is at the same time very clear and even actionable. I think that the ego self axis, I like your image of a road or some kind of line that's connecting, that information can travel up and down on. And I think that we see that in our lives with impulses that we get or promptings that we get to go in a certain direction that at the time don't make any sense. And maybe we struggle with it and we think, why do I feel called to do this? What is this? But we listen to it and we wrestle with it, and maybe we do the thing, even though it doesn't make any sense. And then we look back years later and, oh, well, of course I was meant to do that. And we can see that that was the action of the self communicating with our ego along this ego self axis. guiding our hand in life.
And I think all of us know that without a connection to something greater, as Jung says, a connection to the infinite or the self, there is an emptiness, a quality of some kind of alienation, often a quality of some kind of desperation that may present itself as ceaseless striving.
Depression.
And depression, that life is not enough to have a life that is simply ego-based. And sometimes I think about the process of psychoanalysis as the process of kind of clearing the fallen trees and the brambles and the overgrowth from the road, connecting the ego to the self. Edinger, who has written a book that we'll put in the references called Ego and Archetype, talks about the various ways throughout history that man has connected ego to self. And of course, organized religions have been containers for the archetypes, the organizing principles of the self. These in our present time for many people have fallen away. Sometimes people then seek a substitute in a political movement or some other secular thing that becomes almost a deity. And I think we can look around us in the collective and see where things like that have gone wrong. For example, off the top of my head, something like Jonestown. The way that I think we are pointing to today is what Edinger identifies, and based, of course, on Jung, as finding it within each of us. That if we can confront ourselves and the ultimate questions in our lives, perhaps our own angst, dilemmas, conflicts, difficulty, and we can work with ourselves consciously and suffer the process, that we can discover the self within us. And I think that is a remarkable and encouraging possibility. Because it is possible.
And when we talk about discovering the self inside of us, I think what we're talking about is getting a conscious glimpse of this primordial process. The ego self-access cannot be broken, but it can be distorted, or the ego can thwart and misdirect the influence of the self, defend against it in one way or another. So a lot of the goal of analysis is not so much to establish it, but to clarify it.
Yes.
And to unobstruct it as much as is possible, which is not a simple insight, but actually an entire process of understanding the ways in which we defend against being influenced from within.
And this is described really as a dialogue between ego and something that is more permanent, simply present, going back and forth, that it's not just what I feel like doing or what I want to do or the next promotion, but what am I meant to do? Or as our colleague James Hollis says, what wants to come into the world through me? What greater purpose? And it doesn't have to be earth-shaking, but what greater purpose am I here to serve in my mission, my values, perhaps just being kind?
I want to complicate this a little bit because sometimes the story is, in fact, I think a lot of times the story is fairly straightforward and has a kind of uplifting trajectory. Let's say someone enters analysis and feels a little bit lost or adrift, perhaps, in her life. And in the course of analysis is given permission to consider how her life might be out of sync with the promptings of the self. And through a process of listening more carefully to these impulses and tending to dreams and that kind of thing, discovers maybe that she wants to renegotiate her marriage or perhaps change careers or experiences a shift in values and does some of these things and then has more energy for life, feels more enlivened, a deeper capacity for joy. This is all good, and it happens all the time. However, sometimes the self might want something really kind of dark for us. It's not always, it's very mysterious, and it isn't always uplifting. I think there are people for whom it's very, very difficult to find that contact with the self. So I just want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on all of that too.
So when you think of the self wanting something dark for the individual, what are some of the images that are moving around?
Well, I mean, I've seen people, for example, who have promptings that seem to come from the self for all intents and purposes that look utterly self-destructive by any measure.
There certainly is a dark side to the self, as well as a light side, because this is in the realm of the archetypal, so it's bipolar. However, essentially, I think the trajectory is, according to Jung, toward wholeness. And the darker side may be the side of development that is imaged in myth and religion as alienation.
Yeah. You know, it may be that the darkness has to be lived out in the interest of wholeness, and it still may be a very dark path. I also want to bring up something else to complicate this a little bit. I think a lot of people that come into analysis and are relatively new to it have an expectation that they're going to contact the self either through dream work or active imagination or even in our sessions, and that it's going to be a bit oracular and they're going to be told what to do in essence. And I think, Deb, you raised a minute ago this idea that it's really a dialectic. And I think that's so, so important because it would be so great if the clouds parted and the light broke through and the self spoke and said, you know, you should leave your marriage. But that usually is not what happens. And usually you get some stirrings from the self, and then the ego, the conscious personality, has to wrestle with that and figure out, this is something, I'm getting something, there's some information coming. What the hell do I do with it? What is actually wanted of me?
I think you're raising a really important point about the importance of ego and consciousness and wrestling and suffering and discerning. And the optimistic note here is that we do have to struggle, if necessary, to attain a relationship with the self in its positive aspect. And that is the work that the conscious personality can do. But I think of all of the mythological references that are available of people that struggled and had a dark night of the soul, of Moses in the wilderness, or Jonah in the belly of the whale, you know, or Job suffering his fate, or Jacob wrestling with the angel, that we are called upon consciously to establish this kind of enlivening, meaningful relationship with the self, lest despair, alienation, depression, etc., that side take us in its grip. But we can be, I think, the masters of our own destiny in terms of willing to establish an ego self axis and a relationship with the self.
So I think we've done a broad feeling level assessment of the manifestation of the self. But I know earlier we were talking about Edinger's rather organized way of talking about appearance of the self. And part of his theory is that we begin life or begin consciousness embedded in the self, much in the same way that a plant is embedded in a seed, and that emerging from this absorption into the self is the first task. Now, there's a lot of infant studies work that perhaps one day we can go into, but when we're doing analysis with adults, we can still come up against this problem where the ego is still embedded in the self. And this can show up in some cases as a child complex. For instance, we may have somebody who's had a very, very difficult time creating a life. And one of the signs of this is they'll come in and in one way or another, they'll communicate that they feel that they could do anything at all, but they can't decide on any one particular thing. And so the individual is full of promise in every direction, but no fulfillment. And when any of us are caught in infinite potential, which can be hypnotic, but can't actually stake a claim, that can be one sign that the ego is submerged in the self. One of the resistances in creating some of this dynamic tension between the ego and the self is the capacity to sacrifice some potentialities in order to incarnate, and to incarnate a vision of one's life. I can think of any number of clients, younger clients generally, but not always, who've come in, perhaps they're still living with the parents, or they've come in and out of college, perhaps they've are dating several different people simultaneously, and they're floating in this difficulty of staking a claim. And at first it can feel rather marvelous. Perhaps when we're 15, 16, 17, and we're just resting in all of the possibilities, and life itself is kind of encouraging us to just dream and dream on and discover the bliss. But at a certain point, the march of time begins to grab us and thrust us downward. And then we begin to pay these terrible prices for not incarnating a stance in life.
Yeah, and that does very much relate to a child complex, and children are innocent. They are full of great dreams and potentials, ideas, fantasies, and at some point, it's also irresponsible. And the next stage of life demands a commitment, a choice, embarking on a path through life.
Another sign that we sometimes see clinically when the ego is embedded in the self is a kind of utopian psychology or a utopian philosophy where I could, or all human beings can be perfect and whole and healthy if we were just not subject to our sexual impulses or our instincts. And that if we could just purge all of that out of us, that we would ascend to a life without conflict and a life that has some kind of magical blessing to it. That's another way of talking about the refusal to incarnate, and to incarnate parts of ourselves that are messy and contentious and gorgeous and life-giving, but they can sometimes fall in conflict with the blissful uterine image that people would love to return to or stay in.
And that is a great example, Joseph, of the inflated ego, of that life can be free of suffering and conflict, and we'll all just live this way according to these values with these rules. And that is ego inflation. it is often followed by a fall, by exile, by terrible disappointment and alienation and suffering. And of course, the great example of that is Job, who lived a lovely, wonderful, prosperous life with his family and his children and his pro forma religious observances, thinking that he had it made. And then all these sufferings were visited upon him, which his ego could not make sense of. And there have been many, many, many a utopian community and ideal that have resulted in disastrous ends. It simply can't be done that way.
So we could imagine that because the self holds all potential, even pain and suffering and death exist as potentials in the self, but until we become conscious of experiencing them, they do not exist psychologically. They only exist as an abstraction. And the psychologizing of these potentials is what matures consciousness through that strain of opposites, life and death, pleasure and suffering.
Absolutely. And our good old friend called shadow. There is no avoiding shadow, personal shadow, collective shadow. We have to go through that process and not try to take sort of a spiritual bypass and sort of loft above it by quote, doing the right thing, following some prescribed rules and regs. Psychologically, that's just not the way it works.
So I think we're in this territory of you can't have an ego self axis before you have an ego.
Mm-hmm.
And an ego that is pretty well differentiated from the self.
And differentiation from the self, particularly in more mature people, also is paralleled by a differentiation from the collective. And there's a quote, I know I'm going to mangle it, from Ego and Archetype. It says something like, any step towards individuation is experienced as a crime against the collective. So the soft, surrendered place where people don't think for themselves, but they think whatever they're told to think, whatever social media tells them, or religious figures tell them, or their parents tell them, that has a certain parallel to also being overly identified with the self, with all of these vague ideas that one doesn't wrestle with. So often, when young people particularly wake up and they realize they have a will, one of the first things they do is contend. And the collective often experiences that as a kind of insurrection.
Well, and I think partly what you're leaning toward, Joseph, there is that for a time we may project the self out onto perhaps an established religion, or if that's not our jam, to a political movement or a belief system or even another person.
Absolutely. And we have to start with that, with the projection onto institutions, value systems, the family, all kinds of things.
And mom, we think about these moments where moms are like, oh my God, can I just have a minute alone? And they go to the bathroom and then these little kids' hands sticking under the door crying out for mom, where the child just feels they cannot be a separate entity, that they must be in connection with this self-representation of the parent. And how agonizing it is, for a child. Many people have this memory of being left in kindergarten and this excruciating maturational process that they must exist independent from the mother and to learn that they can thrive without the mother constantly being in sight. And that's a beginning process of, I think, what Edinger called the alienation of the ego, which sounds more negative than perhaps it is. But this sense that the ego is being pushed out of the self, just as mom is pushing them into kindergarten, and saying you just cannot stay in this merger, that's not the natural trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it happens again in college of off you go, perhaps to some faraway state. And there you are, a raw freshman, not sure if you can do this thing. You're supposed to be a young adult, or at least on the verge of young adulthood. And we're challenged again and again to fall back on our own ego resources at first, as later we will be challenged to forego our ego resources as our only source of support.
So this alienation from the self, or separation from the self, is a prelude to an awareness of the greater self as an experience of awareness, not just enmeshment.
Yeah, so there's a conscious relationship rather than being in identification with it.
And this often shows up in fairy tales and myths as the journey through the wilderness, where the hero, the heroine, the young person is either cast out or sets out into the unknown and leaves behind the familiar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a child wondering why in so many fairy tales people kept wandering into the woods. Didn't you have enough sense not to do that? But of course, later on, I realized the woods is the unconscious, that we have to embark into that journey into ourselves in order to find the reward, the treasure, the light, the bride, whatever the reward and treasure is in a given tale.
So many individuals come in trapped also in the state of alienation. And often later in life, that even might be rather common, that they feel cast out from their creativity, cast out from familiar feelings.
From a sense of aliveness. Or meaning.
A sense of belonging. A sense of purpose.
I mean, that is a very common reason why people come into analysis. And I think that's exactly what the territory we're in is. Okay, so how do we help you reconnect with the ego self axis? How do we clear away the debris that's blocking that? And sometimes it's pretty straight shot, and sometimes it's really hard. That's a real place of suffering.
And it's a difficult place for us as analysts because we need to validate the alienation from the self as a developmental process and look to the dreams often for help in terms of navigating the journey through the wilderness, and also what the timing is to help people come back home, meaning to refine the self. And while people are in great suffering, they're often asking, when will this end? This cannot go on for another month, another year. And waiting upon the self is part of that transformative process.
And it can really feel like 40 years in the desert. I wanted us to go back for a minute to this idea that the self can be projected on something out there, and that this could be part of this developmental process that we're outlining. It could be projected onto a church, it could be projected onto a person like a minister or even an analyst. It could be projected onto a political cause or an ideology. And how does this relate, do you think, to our notion of the ego self axis?
Well, I think, developmentally and according to Jung, we kind of have to start with projection. And I often think of it as our potential as if it's a roll of film in one of those metal canisters that at least they used to have in movie theaters. And you kind of have to project the film onto a big screen. You'll never see it unless it's put out there so you can experience it. In some way you can feel and touch and live. The next step after that is taking that projection back in. In other words, coming to a conscious realization that one's, let's say it's an idealization of a film character. It might be a mythological fairy tale or anime character. It might be a particular actor or actress. But then to make meaning of what is that in me? That it's not out there. It's something going on in here, in me. We have to take our projections back and make conscious meaning of them.
And that's an incredibly elegant process if people can wake to this phenomena and actively work to pull the projection back.
Yes.
Many people, particularly in religious contexts, experience a kind of cognitive dissonance, which shows up as being disillusioned. And then the projection is kind of ripped off of the organization or the individual, full of gore and blood in a certain sense,
Mm-hmm.
and thrust back into the self. And people can have a very informative experience of crisis.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm thinking of what my own experience in training, and I think that, I was not alone in this. I think most people arrive in Jungian training with a huge projection on the training process and on the analyst, and you think that you're, in the inner temple, and then you go to an interregional meeting and, you see the analysts sitting around, drinking their coffee, and sometimes you see them even behaving badly, making poor choices and, just being normal, fallible human beings. And it can be it can be really painful to realize, like, oh, this is just an organization. These are just people. And there you go. You're taking that projection back. I'm thinking that when we're not able to take the projection back and we relate to the belief system or the church or the ideology, whatever, as if it's the container of the self, that can be a place where this process gets stuck. Because the truth is that no organization, no ideology is big enough to really contain the energies of the self. And that if we stay there, if that becomes the way that we relate to the self, that can become a pathologic process, can it not?
Well, I think people can really get stymied, for sure.
Yeah, and then I think we're back. I mean, to kind of go back to the Edinger model, we're back in some place where the relationship between the ego and the self is not this dialectic process that we're eventually hoping to land on.
Yes.
But it's more rigidified, and we might be in the realm of possession.
It can certainly fall into the realm of possession. As we know from some of the disastrous histories of cults like the Branch Davidians and so on. But more than that, I think if it stays in an outward projection, an outer container, we don't have the differentiation between what's out there and what's in here that is ultimately needed. And so a certain process of differentiation and individuation doesn't take place. And of course, the disappointment often from the original projection, when that fails us, the disappointment and despair and alienation is very difficult to endure. I'll tell a quick personal story. When my kids went to school, I went back to school to become a special ed teacher. And I wanted to work with adolescents, and I did. I was a high school special ed teacher. And I absolutely projected onto that career, that teaching, all kinds of elements that I would now recognize as the self of love and embracing and kindness and connection and, the whole child, et cetera, et cetera. Well, our program, after I think having been started as a SOP to state regulations, our team was split up. And I admit we were a wild and woolly bunch. And we were young and idealistic, terribly idealistic. And I went through a few years of terrible, terrible disappointment. I absolutely didn't know who I was anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was a real loss of identity because I'd been so identified with the helping energy and archetype. So, what would have happened had my container not broken apart? I would have avoided that suffering, but I also would have avoided an opportunity to face some things in myself and mourn the loss, believe me.
Well, one of the things that can happen if there is a resistance to learning about that projection is people can be plunged into a depression where something deep inside just strips the value out of something.
Mm-hmm.
And then we feel just empty where at one point it was so exciting. And coming back to what you were saying, Lisa, when this is projected onto an organization, let's say a church or a political organization, personally, I think when people begin to feel paranoid about their relationship to the projection, that's the beginning of the projection being pulled off. Because the loss of the fantasy, like the ego is predicting that loss is going to be catastrophic on a feeling level. And so there's a paranoid reinvestment and insulation. So even I don't want to hear anybody talking to me about this. I'm not going to have any friends that don't reaffirm my relationship with this cultic church. And I'm never going to speak to you again because in some way you may be anxious or started interfering with the projection. But that often is the beginning of the transformation.
No, that's
the
great.
Unwilling transformation.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, to put it another way, it's doubling down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I think that is the beginning where the inflation has been penetrated a little bit. So I'm thinking that listeners may be wondering, well, so do I have an ego self-axis? And how do I know if I'm in touch with it? And what do I do if I don't? So what does this sort of look like in the real world here?
When people encounter the self, is that what you mean?
Or what does it look like when you have an ego self-axis that's humming along? Or how can we cultivate it? And I guess one simple answer is that I think one of the mechanisms through which the ego self-axis operates is dreams. Mm-hmm. And every dream can be seen as an attempt on the part of the self to dialogue with the ego.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, after all, where do dreams come from? Certainly not from the ego.
Exactly.
So I think relative to dream work, the self holds an image of the ego's potential, and each night presents in this theatrical form of the dream feedback about how the ego is embodying more of the potential or is blocking the potential that the self is holding and pressing against it.
Yeah, exactly. And, Jung has that beautiful quote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us than we think of ourselves," or something like that. That's exactly right. So the dream is the voice of the self saying, "Hey, here's how I think you're doing, today, this week, past couple days." And every effort to work with our dreams is the ego saying, "I'm listening. I may not be getting it all, but I'm over here and I'm listening." So when you write down your dreams, or you speak with your analyst about your dreams, or you're working with your own dreams, that is an effort to strengthen that ego self-axis.
And in terms of improving that relationship, in the beginning, we may feel constantly confronted, even in a painful way, by our dreams. I think, as you were inferring earlier, Lisa, how do we know that it's going well? It's not that we don't have an ego self-axis, but when is the ego self-axis humming along? And I think that's when the ego is in good coordination with the self and isn't fighting and defending against some of these actualizations that are trying to happen.
And do you think that synchronicity can be an example of when this is humming along well, when we're finding these synchronicities that can sort of be a nod from the universe? Yeah, that's it. You're getting it.
Because that is a way that we can make meaning just in our daily lives. There are little synchronicities, little happenings. We find, that was interesting. I was just thinking of that person and he or she called. Oh, I just remembered I was supposed to do this. It just popped into mind. You see something in the landscape and it gives rise to a little reverie of like, oh my gosh, I remember the time when. So I think it is a sense of wholeness as we go through our daily life in little moments like this. I'm just trying to illustrate that it doesn't have to be some big revelatory kind of process. I also think that having the ability to sort of step back, I think of it as binocular vision, is another step that is very possible to take for people, of that my subjective experience, and I make the analogy to being down on the playing field, is this game is a mess. My plays aren't going well. There are other players blocking me. It's cold. Maybe it's raining. But if I can go up into the skybox and see it from afar more objectively and have both of those, it's a little bit of practice going back and forth that is analogous to the ego-self axis. It's not perhaps exactly the same, but it's a practice round.
You know, when I was a really new clinician, I mean, my first job out of graduate school, I went to this training, and I cannot now for the life of me remember who these people were or who they worked for, but they worked with, pretty severe substance abuse users. And they gave this great training in which they promised to operationalize Jung's ego-self axis, which of course is kind of funny. But it was really, really wonderful, because what they would do, and they did it with us, and this is what they would do with the addicts, is they asked a series of questions. And, it's remarkable that I remember this as well as I do. One was, what did you want to be when you were a little kid? When you were a little kid, what did you dream of being? And another question was, what's something that you do really, really, really well? It might be, I make a great spaghetti sauce. But it was these series of questions that was aimed, I think, at finding that voice of the self, those inner promptings that guide us on our path that we may have lost touch with. And if you can imagine being kind of a hardcore on the street addict for many years, you may have lost those promptings. But even that question, like when you were 5, what did you want to be? That's a little hint maybe at what that voice was prompting you towards. And I think that we can use a similar process with ourselves when we're feeling alienated. It's something like, follow the energy. Where is the energy? What is the thing that enlivens you? What's the thing when you think about it that you get that little jolt of juice? I mean, I've told this story on the podcast so many times now about how I came across Linda Leonard's book, but it just seems like a good little example. I was in graduate school studying international affairs, and it was fine, but it wasn't feeling particularly juicy. But man, I would go into that bookstore and pull Linda Leonard's book off the shelf. Linda Leonard is a Jungian analyst who writes beautiful books, and I would get a jolt of energy. And I wasn't listening to it because I would put it back on the shelf and be like, oh, I have too much reading in, international affairs. But that's exactly the place where the ego self axis was saying, no, Lisa, it's no longer about international affairs. You got to move on to something else. And it's here. It's in this book. Pick it up off the shelf and buy it, you stupid idiot, So I think when we're looking for how do we reconnect, how do we find this? It's where is the energy? Where are your instincts leading you? Note what you feel instinctively drawn to and take it seriously.
What do you love?
Where do you have strong feelings?
I also think that in these moments of not knowing, the confusion, the feeling of being lost, even despairing or depressed, it is consoling to know that this is part of the journey.
Yeah, exactly.
It has meaning too, and I'm thinking about your story about the studying international affairs, and what a good, sensible piece of graduate work that was. Then that other yearning and so on of this is part of it, and many a fairy tale, many a dream, many a religious text and mythological tradition is there to keep you company.
And it is true that when I'm feeling lost, as I frequently do in one way or another, I will remind myself, the self is here. The self is active in this too.
Yes.
And I don't know where it's going, but there's something larger than me here.
Yeah.
And I have to trust that.
So this seems like a propitious moment for us to turn to a dream.
Hello, listeners. This is Lisa, and I wanted to let you know that my book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, will be available this May from Sounds True Publishing. In my book, I take a deep dive into the psychological journey of motherhood using myths, personal stories, dreams, and of course, fairy tales. At my website, lisamarciano.com, you can read an excerpt from the book and learn more about me and my writing. You can also sign up for my free email course when you pre-order your copy. That's lisamarciano.com. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.
Our dreamer today is 37 years old. She's a woman and an accountant. And here's the dream. I was taking part in a marathon. At first, I was doubtful I could complete the race. As I started running, I realized I was not losing my energy too quickly, and my hope I would reach the destination was growing within me. Toward the end of the race, I still had plenty of energy, so I decided to accelerate a bit, even though I could see so many people were ahead of me, and therefore I had no chance of winning. As I reached the end, I checked the results and noticed I was around the 14th person to arrive. I was, however, among the first female participants. I was very excited and wanted my partner to see the results. Then I somehow started running back along the same route, still full of energy. While I was running back, someone was announcing the prizes, and I knew I would be offered a pram and could choose out of 3 types. One of the prams offered as a prize was a, quote, German pram, which had a seat for the baby that could be turned around so that the baby is either looking forward or looking back at the parent who is pushing. End of the dream. And here is some significant context that she offers us. In the past, she had several miscarriages, and then her marriage slowly corroded and came to an end. She's now in a new relationship, and my partner and I would like to have children, but since we haven't been together for long, we're taking some time to go through the honeymoon phase and decide whether we're strong enough to go through this new adventure. I'm now 37 and had miscarriages in the past, and am worried I won't be able to stay pregnant when we finally do decide to try. As we live in a Catholic country, our chances of her adopting are slim, as people who divorced in the past are often deemed ineligible. I'm currently going through a number of gynecological tests. I'm a jogger And I do occasionally take part in running competitions, although have never tried a marathon. The main feelings in the dream were excitement and enthusiasm. And she also adds that she's been in Jungian therapy for about 2 years.
Well, it seems to me like this dream is an opportune dream to be discussing given our topic today.
Yes.
This seems like a little gift from the psyche, from the self, encouraging this dreamer and indicating to her that she is going to have the stamina, the energy to finish the race. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but it seems propitious, doesn't it?
It's lovely, the situation itself of taking part in a marathon and thinking of marathon as life. Life is a marathon. And the ego's doubtfulness that I could complete the race. But she discovers there is more energy in her than she thought.
You know, I'm a couple things about this. First of all, people ahead of her, no chance of winning. But the point of a marathon usually is to finish.
Yeah. Yes.
Usually you're just very, unless you're a really elite athlete, it's just an accomplishment to finish.
It's a contest with yourself. Can I do this big thing? Can I run the race? It's about personal best. I'm also interested in the fact that it notices she's about the 14th person to arrive. And 14 is midway between the lunar month. The moon waxes for 14 days and it wanes, and then there are 3 days of darkness. So it's a kind of tipping point halfway between each month.
Yeah, which also links it potentially to the menstrual cycle.
Mm-hmm. I think, of course, we can't miss the symbolism of being offered a pram as a prize. In the real world, a most unnatural kind of reward that would be offered, but it's promising, and the fact that the baby can face either way sort of embraces both of those polarities.
Well, it's almost a Janus kind of image, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Janus, the double-headed god who looks both forward and back. So there's some kind of ability to synthesize both a forward-looking perspective, but also an ability to take in what's happened in the past.
I'm sitting with an ambivalent feeling, and I was thinking about the word marathon. And while we have our personal associations that it's a kind of heroic opportunity, it's a test of endurance and a competition, but the etymology of the word marathon comes from a Greek story from around 1490 BC. This particular runner ran to Athens from the plains of Marathon to tell of the allied Greek victory there over the Persian army. And the original story that he ran from Athens to Sparta to seek aid, which arrived too late to participate in the battle. So there's something in the marathon idea which also suggests, even though there is a rally of robust dynamism to get there, to do one's duty, there is no guarantee that there will be a story of success at the arrival.
Yeah, I was thinking something along those lines too, Joseph. I mean, I think this is clearly a really positive dream, and it seems really encouraging to really be encouraging of the dreamer. And it does seem to be saying, look, there will be some new life. You're going to need a pram, but the new life may or may not be an actual baby.
Yes, and the transformative value in the psyche might be to run the marathon. That something is going to be learned through the discipline, the training, the dynamism, the fortitude. And perhaps the most powerful discovery is that she is not losing her energy too quickly and that she can reach a destination with some hope inside of her. And just as you said, this capacity to access energy and to reach the goal, that may be the great gift of the dream. It may or may not be commenting on whether or not she's going to have children, because dreams are best interpreted symbolically and not literally. But it is something about fortitude and the ability to set a goal and to attain to and successfully arrive where one's volition has landed.
I think it's interesting that she then runs back along the course. It fits with, for me, a little bit with this image of the pram that can face both ways, because she can retrace her steps. It's almost like makes me wonder about her process of being in therapy, because that's one of the things that we do in therapy is we look back at our lives and we see how it has brought us to where we are. So even in her victory, she's able to be self-reflective, perhaps.
I wonder, Joseph, if your sort of cautionary note about the origin of marathon might apply here in terms of the context where she says, oh, we're taking time to go over the honeymoon phase of the relationship, see if we're strong enough to go through this adventure. That in the dream, she's excited and enthusiastic and she has all this surfeit of energy versus stay the course, be more temperate, and that the promise is of new life. And it faces back and it faces ahead. She can retrace her steps, as you said, Lisa. There's going to be a process. But I think the dream clearly says there's going to be new life of some kind.
I want to share that when I was considering applying for analytic training, I was all ready to do it. And then I found out I was pregnant. So I didn't apply that year. And then my daughter was born. And then there was this whole question of, could I train if I had a baby? What would that be like? And so this was something I spent a lot of time wondering about. And I was talking to people and I was taking it to analysis. And I had a dream that I was running a marathon holding my daughter. It had a sort of positive feeling to it. It's like, yeah, I can run a marathon holding a baby. and I remember taking it as, okay, I guess, training is a marathon. And I guess I'm going to be able to do this. And, I did. So I just wanted to offer that.
I want to lean into one bit in the dream. So she arrives. She's first among the female participants. She's very excited, and I want to tell my partner, or rather, I wanted my partner to see the results. Then I somehow started running backwards, running back. So I'm wondering if there is also a bit of a confrontation in the dream, that there was a running forward and attaining a forward trajectory. And then there's a shift of consciousness of having to need something from the partner that causes her to run backwards, to have to possibly regress from this heroic determination in order to seek something from the partner. And that's when the whole pram thing comes forward. If this were my client, I would want to work with them about what it means for the partner to see the results and what effect that intentionality has on her development.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.